There's MGMT with a synthesizer heavy hit called Kids from their debut record Oracular Spectacular. Electronic music goes a lot further back than you probably think. As far as anyone can tell, the first person to use electricity to make music was Jean-Baptiste de Laborde. In 1759, he invented an electric harpsichord that used clappers charged with static electricity to ring bells. In 1876, Elisha Gray, the dude some people say really invented the telephone, put together a self-vibrating electromagnetic circuit. Today, we would call that an oscillator. And he called it the electromagnetic telegraph. It could transmit tones down telegraph wires, which was a big deal back then. In 1898, Thaddeus Cahill demonstrated the teleharmonium, the first electronic musical instrument that you plugged into a wall or hooked up to a battery. Then, a year later, William Duddell unveiled what could have been the first fully electronic musical instrument. He called this thing the singing arc. It was a keyboard connected to a carbon arc lamp. The more electricity the operator applied to the lamp through the keyboard, the higher the pitch the lamp emitted. But the biggest early breakthrough came in 1918 when a Bolshevik scientist named Leo Theremin introduced his new electronic instrument. He called it the etherphone, but then he had a second thought and named it after himself. The Theremin, and they still make Theremins today, is a box with a rod sticking out of one side and a loop of metal on the other. You play it by carefully waving your hands around it. It's tough, but when you get it right, you have a sound that sounds somewhere between a violin and a female opera singer. Leo and his Theremin came to the attention of Lenin, who declared this to be a great Soviet invention. He even sent Leo on a world tour to promote this brilliant bit of Soviet technology. Theremins later turned up in science fiction movies. Recognize this from Forbidden Planet from 1956? It was the first movie to have a completely electronic soundtrack, thanks largely to the Theremin. In the 1960s, Brian Wilson used a Theremin in Good Vibrations.
I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
And Jimmy Page used it in Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love. But in the beginning, the Theremin was thought to offer much to classical musicians. In any event, the Theremin did much better than its inventor. In 1938, Leo Theremin was caught in one of Stalin's purges and sent to a gulag. Then the KGB found him, put him to work, and that's when he invented the electronic bugging device. The Theremin wasn't the only electronic instrument to emerge in the early part of the 20th century. In 1928, Maurice Martineau invented something called the Ohms Martineau, and I know that you've heard one of these before. Radiohead has at least 6 of these things. They've used all of them on stage simultaneously during a performance of a song called How to Disappear Completely.
In a little while, I'll be gone.
Other ancient electronic instruments included the trotonium, the emicon, the electron, the novochord, the abukov, the teleharmonium, which, by the way, weighed 200 tons and had to be transported in a rail car. And then there was the revolutionary sackbut. Yeah, it was called the sackbut. That might be the first ever true synthesizer, and it was invented by a Canadian named Hugh LeCaine. You played a piano-type keyboard with one hand and manipulated the sound with the other. Here's a bit of one of the pieces that he wrote on his sackbut. There was a great breakthrough in 1938 when René Bertrand invented the oscillator. This was a more advanced version of what Elisha Gray had invented 50 years earlier. But Bertrand's device gave the operator more control over the squeals and bleeps that characterized electronic music. Now here's where history gets a little bit weird. Young Germans, those coming of age after the defeat of World War II, were, like other baby boomers around the world, getting into new, modern music. Music that wasn't what their parents liked. But they weren't necessarily into the rock that was coming out of the US and the UK. They wanted music of their own, something upon which they could build a new, modern, post-war German identity. And a number of them gravitated towards electronic music. Now, the government helped. State radio stations and universities built special studios where musicians were encouraged to experiment with new sounds and new technologies. The BBC did something similar with what they called the Radiophonic Workshop, a skunkworks of sorts, where new ways of creating sound were developed for various BBC radio and TV properties. And this is where the Doctor Who theme came from. At the same time the British and the Germans were messing about, Columbia University in New York built a giant machine with the help of RCA. Not only could this machine accurately imitate most traditional instruments, it could also be programmed to produce a near infinite variety of artificial sounds. And this is why they called it the Olsen Bear Sound Synthesizer. Now this thing was huge. It filled an entire room at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center. And if you wanted it to do something, you had to make dozens, even hundreds of manual connections using lengths of patch cords. It used a tremendous amount of electricity, and the heat it gave off was stifling. But people were fascinated with it, and musicians and poets and writers and theater people jammed Columbia. They all wanted to experiment. Now here's an example of a piece created with the Olsen Bear Sound Synthesizer. Little black box that made it easier to tame electronically generated sounds. He called it a voltage-controlled synthesizer. From there, Dr. Bob Moog, a guy who loved to build theremins, got some help from electronics professors at Columbia and the University of Toronto. The result was the first Moog synthesizer, and in 1967, it made its debut appearance in a rock song. The track was Star Collector by, wait for it, the Monkees. Now that was interesting, but the synthesizer was still seen as something used by scientists, not rock and roll folk. Even after the Beatles used a smattering of synth on the Abbey Road album, no one was really all that bothered about the new technology. So it was back to the world of classical music, where Dr. Bob found an ally in Walter Carlos. In 1968, Carlos released a totally electronic album entitled Switched on Bach. And the crazy thing sold 1 million copies, and suddenly the synthesizer was hot. The next major development happened on January 24th, 1970. That's when Dr. Bob introduced the Mini-Moog, a small, portable, all-in-one keyboard synthesizer. It could do virtually everything the giant machines of the 1950s could do, except at a reasonable price. Now, it did sell for about $2,000, a lot of money, especially in 1970, but it wasn't totally crazy. Other companies soon followed, and soon rock and roll musicians had a chance to move beyond the realm of guitars, bass, drums, piano, and organ. You probably recognize that last bit as being from Lucky Man from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Keyboardist Keith Emerson became a huge fan of Dr. Bob's machines and assembled these giant modular contraptions that looked awesome on stage. Then came a guy named Stan Free. I don't think anybody remembers his name, but he did have a top 10 hit in 1972 with an all-electronic instrumental under the name Hot Butter, and the track was called Popcorn. But now we have to go back to Germany. By the time Popcorn was becoming a hit in America, the Germans had had almost 20 years of electronic music under their belts, and things were about to change. More on what happened next in a moment.
More of The Secret History of Rock coming up.